so today we get to start talking about Reconstruction. The Civil War is over, and now we have to figure out, well, how do we put everything back together? How do we reconstruct the Union? And we're going to face a lot of problems, especially in the South. And what do we do with these newly freed slaves? How keep our agricultural economy? And all of these many, many questions. So in simple terms, what is Reconstruction? It's putting the nation back together after the Civil War, and it's going to address the questions of how do we do this? How do we treat the South? Do we punish them for leaving the Union? What do we do with the Confederate leaders? What do we do with the newly freed slaves? Does abolition mean that blacks and whites are equal? So that's what Reconstruction is putting it back together and figuring out these questions. So after the Civil War, the South was devastated. Think about Sherman's march to the sea and his idea of total war, and then what that means after the war. Towns are burned, farms are destroyed. The South is already facing the problem of a huge loss of men. Of course, part of the war was to destroy the railroad system so that you couldn't move supplies. So the South is really a mess, and they're going to have to rebuild. And they're going to have to figure out how to do that without slaves. This is a picture of Charleston. I'm sure that all of you, having lived in the South, have been to Charleston at some point. So you can see that this picture, the immense devastation and the rebuilding that's going to have to take place. But what are the goals of the government? What is the federal government's goal for Reconstruction? Well, their goal is not to rebuild the South. That's the South's responsibility. Their goal is to get the South back into the Union, get them to have senators and congressmen, and get them to accept the outcome of the war, that they cannot have slaves. So that is the goal. And of course, Lincoln had a plan for this. But Lincoln's going to get assassinated, and it's always amazing to me to think about that the war ended, and then almost immediately he was assassinated. He was shot only 5 days after the surrender at Appomattox. He was shot by John Wilkes Booth in Ford's Theater. I picked this picture just for a fun fact. This is the picture of Lincoln that's on the $5 bill. So Lincoln's plan is going to sort of have to be put on the back burner for Reconstruction. But don't get caught up in too much in his assassination. It's going to be sort of a rabbit trail. What we want to focus on is if Lincoln is assassinated, well, who's going to push through Reconstruction? And that's, of course, going to be the vice president. So we don't want to get off on a rabbit trail on Lincoln's assassination. We want to focus on Andrew Johnson and his policies for Reconstruction. What is he going to do about the South? And we call this presidential Reconstruction. We're going to face a second phase of Reconstruction, but presidential Reconstruction is under Andrew Johnson. And Andrew Johnson, being from Tennessee, takes a very lenient attitude towards the South. He's going to basically let the South decide what to do, and he's going to let them form their own constitutions. He's going to pardon some of the Confederate generals. And you can imagine that after the war, if you said, okay, well, it's up to you to decide how to handle the free slaves, well, they're not ready for full integration yet. And so they begin passing something called black codes. Black codes are basically going to restrict the movement of African Americans after the Civil War. Yes, the slaves are free, but they can't do certain things because of these black codes. For instance, some states are going to require written evidence of employment for the coming year, or else the free slave would be required to work on a plantation. Well, if you were immediately freed as a slave, you don't have a lot of skills, you've just been working in a farm, you have no saved money. And of course, there's a lot of animosity towards these newly freed slaves. White people aren't going to hire them. So this is very restrictive on the movement of of African Americans. For example, in South Carolina, in our wonderful state, or in my wonderful state, in South Carolina, African Americans had to pay special tax if they were not farmers or servants. They were not allowed to hunt or fish in some areas. The African Americans weren't able to own guns. Some even had their dogs taxed. Americans were barred from orphanages, parks, schools, and public facilities. So you can see that black codes, yes, you're free, but you're being heavily taxed, and often you're going to end up right back on the farm underneath maybe even the master that you served before. So black codes were being allowed to be made under President Johnson and presidential Reconstruction. So as you can imagine, this is not sitting well with many Northerners, and we're going to enter into what's called the second phase of Reconstruction, it's often called Congressional Reconstruction or Radical Reconstruction, because the North is upset because the South is not being punished, and it kind of seems like the Civil War was fought and things are just going back to the way they were before the war. So in the second phase of Reconstruction, or Congressional Reconstruction or Radical Reconstruction, Republicans, now remember Republicans are the Free Soil Party, the party of Lincoln, Republicans are going to come to power and start taking over Reconstruction. These radical Republicans want to prevent the South from just returning to the way it was before the war. And they're going to want to punish the South for starting the war. So Military Reconstruction Act was passed during this time period, and it divided the South up into military districts, and they began dictating how the states would run. And this is going to allow for a lot of opportunities for African Americans underneath this military act. We're going to see a lot of African Americans rise into politics and have a lot of the freedoms that they were denied. Of course, with the radical Republicans in office, they're trying to pass a lot of amendments, and they're to the Constitution. They're going to try to pass voting laws and citizenship laws. And Johnson, of course, is going to veto them. He vetoed a lot of the legislation that they were pushing through. So the radical Republicans impeach him. And impeachment does not mean that you're removed from office. It doesn't mean that he left and someone else took over. It's just a process to go through to be removed. It's the process of removing a president. So he was impeached, but he was not convicted. So he was allowed to finish out his term. But of course, he lost all of his power through the impeachment process. He really couldn't do a whole lot after the impeachment process. I want to pause here and say something about the class that you're taking. I really want you to be watching the videos because we don't ask you questions about everything, and it's important that you know everything that's in the videos. So to make sure that you're watching the videos, I want to ask you a question, and you need to answer this question in your lesson. It's basically to make sure that you're watching the videos. So the question for this lesson is, who was the only other president to be impeached? So you can just add that to your lesson however you want to. Who was the only other president to be impeached? And of course the answer to that would be Bill Clinton. So during this time period, you need to be familiar with 3 amendments to the Constitution that are really important. We call these the Reconstruction Amendments, and they are the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. The 13th Amendment basically abolished slavery, right? At the end of the war, the slaves are freed. That's the 13th Amendment. The 14th Amendment is going to give African Americans citizenship. And you would think, well, all slaves are free. Of course they're citizens. Not necessarily. Like we saw with the black codes, they were being denied certain rights, right, through taxes or not being allowed to go due process in courts, not being allowed to appear on juries. So with the 14th Amendment, it basically said the South could not infringe on the rights of African Americans, that they were citizens. They had the same rights as everyone else. They can vote, they can serve on juries, they can assemble, they have freedom of religion. Everything that a white person has, the African Americans have as well. So the 14th Amendment granted all the free slaves citizenship. And of course, the 15th Amendment it made sure that they had the right to vote. A lot of the black codes were aimed at preventing African Americans from voting, of course, because African Americans, if you think back to earlier lessons with the triangle at the very top, but they don't make up the majority of the people. If you go down the triangle, the majority of the population were slaves. So now all those slaves are free, and if they are a voting bloc, that's going to be, that's a huge thing. So the 15th Amendment granted African Americans the right to vote. So you can sort of remember it as freedom, citizenship, vote. Very simple, straightforward. So let's look at another organization that really helped African Americans during this time period. And that's going to be the Freedmen's Bureau. The Freedmen's Bureau was a government agency that was set up to help newly freed slaves get back into society. And it's going to provide them with a free education. And it's going to be really important because a lot of your leaders are going to emerge with the help of the Freedmen's Bureau because they were able to get free education. And that's very important to know that the Freedmen's Bureau was during this time period and helped African Americans back into society. So, with the Freedmen's Bureau's education, African Americans are going to take full advantage of the opportunities that are available to them. They're going to begin voting. They're going to be taking office. Soon, African Americans are going to make up the majority of the Southern legislatures. So remember the social structure again, that triangle. So during this time period, you're going to have over 600 blacks are going to actually serve on local legislatures. You're going to have senators and House members. So during this period of Reconstruction, you have a lot of social progress, especially now that they're able to vote. But they're not making a lot of economic progress. African Americans did not make much progress on the economic side of things. Most slaves, they knew a lot about agriculture. Sherman is going to promise at the end of the war that every slave be given reparations or sort of a compensation for being enslaved. And we talk about this as the 40 acres and a mule, because he said, we're going to give every slave 40 acres so that they can farm, because that's what they know. They can get some money, and then they can make progress, and they can move from there. But these 40 acres and a mule did not happen, especially under Johnson and the presidential Reconstruction. The land that was given to them, they had for a little while, but then Johnson was an Indian giver and took it back. So the Farm Bureau is going to help landless African Americans get land, and they're going to do this through something called sharecropping. Sharecropping is basically a system in which African American families can rent small plots of land in return for a portion of the crop to be given to the landowner at the end of each year. African Americans didn't want to work for wages because they didn't want to be under the discipline of a master or like a chain gang, like when they were slaves, right? They didn't want to work that way. They felt they were free. They didn't want to do that. They wanted to have their own land. So they did it through getting the land and then giving back a portion of their crops. However, they often went into debt to pay for the supplies. They would have to get seed, and they'd have to get the horses or the mule, and they'd have to get the plow. And so at the end of the year, when they went to pay back for renting the land, and the supplies, it often was the same or more than what they made. So they often went into debt. And this system of sharecropping is sort of an endless cycle, and it often looked a lot like the plantation system. So where did the African Americans go once they were freed? Where did the newly freed slaves go? Some did go in search of their families, and they were moved west, but it's not going to be these migration west that we'll see later. For the most part, African Americans are going to stay in the South, working on these small rented farms in the sharecropping system. So after the Civil War, you need to be familiar with two terms. One term is a funny term to me for some reason. Is carpetbaggers. Carpetbaggers are going to be seen as these Northerners who come down south and they buy up land maybe that Southerners can't afford to have it anymore, and they're looking to get rich and sort of off the backs of the poor broken Southerners. So they call these Northerners moving down looking to make a profit carpetbaggers. And they do this because they would come down with nothing but what they carry in their carpet, or one satchel sort of thing. So it's a derogatory term used by the South for these people. The other term you need to sort of know is the word scallywag. And scallywag, again, is a derogatory term used by Southerners to describe other Southerners who supported the equal opportunities for African Americans, who joined the Republican Party. So white Southern Republicans, Southerners would refer to as scallywags. So the South is not integrating well, and you're going to see during this time period an emergence of hate groups, especially towards African Americans. Of course, that would be the KKK. So from this time period, we're going to see extreme intimidation, right? They don't want blacks to vote, want them to have the same rights as them. So you're going to see violence towards African Americans, especially in the form of lynching. For its part, the Ku Klux Klan has dedicated itself to like an underground campaign of violence against the Republican leaders and voters, both black, mostly black, some white, in an effort to reverse those policies of radical Reconstruction, and they want to restore white supremacy in the South. South Carolina, of course, is actually known to have one of the larger groups of the KKK during this time. So in South Carolina, there was an incident where there were 500 masked men, and they attacked this jail and they lynched 8 black prisoners. So they definitely were this group is definitely alive and trying to intimidate black voters. And you need to know that the KKK was very active during this time period. So how does all this end? Like, how does Reconstruction finally come to a close? And it's actually pretty sad. There's an election in 1876, and you don't really need to understand the election of 1876 except that it was contested. We couldn't decide who won. We couldn't figure out whether the Tilden won or Hayes won, and the Democrats and Republicans were basically beating their heads against each other, and there was talk of maybe going back to war. So it was a contested election, and in the months following the election of 1876, the Republican and Democrats are going to secretly get together and come up with a compromise to resolve the election and to address other outstanding issues So, under the term of this agreement, the Democrats agreed to accept the Republican presidential electors, so Hayes becomes president. So Hayes is sort of pushed into office sort of through this backroom deal. It provided the Republicans agreed to the following things. The Republicans are agreed to withdraw federal troops from the remaining positions in the South, and they're going to appoint Democrats to patronage positions in the South, and they're going to appoint to the president's cabinet. But the big thing is that they're going to pull out those federal troops that were really protecting African Americans and allowing them to vote and make such progress. So, to the 4 million slaves in the South, the Compromise of 1877 was a huge betrayal, right? Republicans' efforts to assure civil rights for the blacks is going to be totally abandoned. The white population, of course, is going to be anxious to get on with making money, and no serious efforts are going to be made to allow African Americans to integrate completely until the 1950s and the 1960s with the civil rights movement. So the Construction era does not come to a great close for African Americans. The South is going to be immediately start implementing Jim Crow laws, and Jim Crow's laws basically are going to separate blacks from whites. That's where you get these white waiting rooms and black waiting rooms, white water fountains and black water fountains. They're going to re-implement those old black codes of laws requiring tests for voting, poll taxes. Between like 1890 and 1910, the Confederate States are going to start rewriting their constitutions, and they're going to put in place laws that disenfranchise or prevent blacks from voting. This is going to be poll taxes, literary tests, comprehension tests, all sorts of things. Plessy versus Ferguson is a court case that you need to be familiar with. And it basically is the judicial branch of the government legalizing segregation in the South. So, way to go, Supreme Court, again, not your brightest moment. Plessy versus Ferguson was when Plessy was riding a train and he wanted to sit in the white car, and he was removed. And so he took it all the way to the Supreme Court saying that this was not right and it violated his civil rights. And the Supreme Court ruled that it wasn't violating his civil rights, that separate but equal was constitutional. So during this time period, it is not so great for African Americans. But you're going to see a lot of great leaders emerge in trying to deal with segregation, and they're going to fight segregation. They're just going to disagree on how to do it. And you need to be familiar with some of those leaders. You need to be familiar with Booker T. Washington, George Washington Carver, W.E. Du Bois, and Ida Wells Barnett. These are the African American leaders that you need to know about. So Booker T. Washington is your first one. He's going to be born a slave. His ideas are that hard work and determination can get you wherever and whatever you want to do. He's a real strong proponent of hard work. He gets his education through the Freed Bureau, and he does extraordinarily well. His ideas came to be highly criticized because he believed that the way that African Americans were going to make any progress was through jobs, that it didn't really matter if it was bad and segregation was wrong, but without jobs and without money, none of that really mattered. And so he's going to give something called a speech called the Atlanta Compromise, and it basically was saying that you can make concessions on segregation as long as companies would hire black people or hire African Americans, because they weren't doing it. You had these textile companies and they were only hiring whites. And so he really pushed for jobs. He's going to be the founder of the Tuskegee Institute, and at this institute, he was training former slaves to know how to do agricultural jobs and manual labor. And a lot of people criticize that it shouldn't be just about these manual labor jobs, it should be whatever they wanted. But that was his real focus in getting African Americans jobs that they could do and earn money almost immediately. And he did very well, and he helped a lot of people get out of poverty, including this man. George Washington Carver is going to go to the Tuskegee Institute, and he's going to work in agriculture, and he's going to become one of the most prominent scientists and inventors of his time. He was a teacher at the Tuskegee Institute, and he's known for coming up with over 100 different products for the peanut. It's going to be dyes, plastics, gasoline. So even with all its criticism towards agriculture, the Tuskegee Institute did help a lot of African Americans. You should be familiar with W.E. Du Bois, and he's sort of much different than Washington in that he was very well educated. When I was reading about him, the amount of degrees that he received is amazing. He prestigious schools, he earned a PhD from Harvard, so you can see him as not really like the idea that all African Americans should be agriculture. He was very much for wanting them to be in positions where like teachers and government and sort of more of like the white collar jobs. And he had this talented group of students, and they're going to emerge as future leaders. He's also the founder of the NAACP, and he's going to serve as a huge motivator for African Americans and advocating equal treatment. Ida Wells Barnett, she is the woman that you need to be familiar with in the group. She was educated in a Reconstruction school by the Farms Bureau. She's mainly a journalist, and she's going to see her friend lynched, and that's going to be sort of a catalyst in her life, and she's going to start anti-lynching campaigns in the South. And she was a part of the founding of the NAACP, but she's going to leave the NAACP because she believes it's not militant enough. She really believed that African Americans should arm themselves and sort of rise up, and of course the NAACP wasn't militant. But having seen the horribleness of the Ku Klux Klan and segregation living in the South and seeing her friends lynched is definitely going to push her towards more violent measures. So we've seen the Reconstruction throughout the South, and it's important to note that it started out underneath presidential construction, moved through radical Reconstruction where you had all that progress for African Americans, and then of course at the end of Reconstruction we saw it all go away and the reemergence of Jim Crow laws, the Ku Klux Klan. But even through all of this, you're going to have the emergence of some really great leaders that you need to learn about.